I pulled into the parking lot at Naval Station Norfolk, feeling like I was already behind. Taylor's promotion ceremony was the kind of event families bragged about for decades. My sister was about to pin on lieutenant commander, and the Mercer family was ready to act like it was a coronation. My mom had her hair done, my dad had dusted off his old dress blues even though he retired years ago, and I was just hoping to sit quietly, clap at the right time, and not make things awkward. That's all I thought I needed to do. I got out of my car and straightened my jacket. I wasn't in uniform, just a simple blouse and slacks. No need to draw attention. The sun was sharp, bouncing off windshields and the white walls of the officers' club. People were milling around in clusters, trading hugs and Navy gossip. I could see a few of Taylor's classmates from the academy, already talking like they were auditioning for a documentary. The whole thing smelled like fresh-cut grass, cologne, and self-importance. I walked toward the entrance. A young sailor was stationed there with a clipboard and a tablet, checking off names as families walked in. He looked nervous, the way junior enlisted always do when they're forced into ceremonial duty. When it was my turn, I gave him my name, Quinn Mercer. He scrolled, frowned, scrolled again. Then he looked up with the kind of polite regret you only see from someone delivering bad news they didn't create. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, you're not on the list." At first, I thought it was just a mistake. Maybe he skipped a line. "Try again," I said. He flipped the tablet around to show me. No Mercer besides Colin, Linda, Taylor, and Taylor's husband. My name wasn't there, not even at the bottom, not even misspelled. Just gone. Before I could speak, I heard a voice behind me. "She's not on the list?" It was my dad. He was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, the same posture he used when I was a kid, and he caught me sneaking cookies before dinner. The sailor shook his head. My dad let out a short laugh and said loud enough for others to hear, "Of course she's not invited." The words didn't knock me down. They didn't even surprise me. But hearing them, in public, at the gate to my own sister's ceremony, hit like sandpaper across an old wound. A few people standing nearby chuckled softly, assuming it was some kind of family joke. My dad's smirk told me it wasn't. I could see Taylor through the glass doors. She was inside already, beaming, shaking hands, her uniform perfect down to the shine on her shoes. She looked like the cover of a recruiting poster. My mom hovered close, fussing with her hair like Taylor was still 10 years old and about to sing at a school play. Not once did anyone inside look my way. I turned back to the sailor. "I'm her sister," I said, as calmly as I could. "Quinn Mercer. I should be on there." He glanced at my dad, then at me, then back at the screen. His voice was almost a whisper. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I really can't let you in without your name." I stepped aside so the line could keep moving. People brushed past me, barely looking, eager to get to the free champagne and Navy brass. My dad didn't even stop to talk. He just followed my mom inside, adjusting his jacket like he was walking into battle. So there I was, standing outside the biggest day of my sister's life, apparently erased. Not forgotten, erased. Someone had made sure of it. And judging by the look Taylor gave me earlier in the week, when she told me the ceremony was family only, I knew exactly who had pulled my name. I walked back a few steps toward the lot, trying to steady myself. The breeze carried the sound of laughter from inside. Every clink of glass felt like a reminder that I was supposed to stay on the outside looking in. It wasn't new. My whole life had been one long series of standing just beyond the frame, while the rest of the Mercers posed for the photo. But this was different. This was deliberate, public, humiliating. I leaned against my car, staring at the officers' club entrance. I could have driven away right then. Gone home, changed into sweatpants, poured a drink, and let them have their night. That's what they expected. That's what I usually did, let them win the narrative, play the part of the invisible sibling. But standing there, clutching my keys, I felt the weight of my ID in my pocket, the little plastic card that carried more truth about me than my family ever wanted to admit. They had no idea who I really was or what I had done, and maybe that was my fault, because I never shoved it in their faces. My career had been built in silence, and I thought silence would be enough. But at that gate, with my name missing on purpose, silence felt like surrender. Inside, I heard the muffled voice of the master of ceremonies warming up the crowd, telling everyone to take their seats. I caught a glimpse of Taylor stepping onto the stage, tall and polished, everything my dad ever wanted in a child. The applause was loud enough to carry through the glass. I looked down at my car, at the trunk I hadn't opened since I parked. The uniform bag was in there, pressed and ready. Not because I planned to wear it today, but because I always kept it close for unexpected orders. For the first time, I thought about what it would mean to put it on now. To walk in not as the unwanted sister but as the officer I had become, whether they liked it or not. The idea settled in slowly, like a challenge I'd been avoiding for years. My dad's smirk replayed in my head, Taylor's name echoing on the microphone, my own name absent from the list. I wasn't going to argue at the door. I wasn't going to beg for a chair. If I was going in, it would be on my terms, wearing the one thing they couldn't erase. The sailor at the entrance looked nervous again as another family approached. He wouldn't look my way. He didn't need to. My decision was already made. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until the leather creaked. The noise of applause leaking from inside made me think of another time I was left standing on the outside. It wasn't the first, and it sure as hell hadn't started today. When we were kids, everything in the Mercer house revolved around Taylor. My dad used to line us up in the backyard for training sessions. Taylor got a whistle, a stopwatch, and my dad cheering her on while she ran laps like she was already commanding a battalion. I got told to hold the clipboard. That was my role, clipboard kid. I remember one summer barbecue where the whole neighborhood came by. Dad had just gotten back from deployment, and he decided it was the perfect time to announce Taylor's acceptance into the Naval Academy. Mom lit up like she was launching fireworks. Neighbors clapped, uncles slapped my dad on the back, and Taylor strutted like she'd already been promoted. Me? I had just won first place in a national cyber defense competition. I'd stayed up for nights straight, working through algorithms, breaking codes, and outsmarting hundreds of kids from across the country. I brought the medal out to show everyone, proud for once. My dad barely looked. "That's nice, Quinn," he said, eyes already back on Taylor, "but it's not a commission." Everyone laughed politely, like he'd told a funny joke. I stood there holding a medal that might as well have been a participation ribbon. It didn't stop there. Family photos always tilted toward Taylor. Holiday toasts were about her grades, her trophies, her milestones. I was the blurry figure on the edge of the frame, usually cut off when the photos got printed. The one moment that burned the deepest came the year I got promoted to lieutenant junior grade. I was home on leave, uniform in my bag, waiting for the right moment to tell them. I stood in the hallway, listening to my dad in the kitchen talking to an old shipmate. He didn't know I was there. "Quinn's smart," he said, pouring himself a drink, "but she's not a warfighter." That was it. A sentence delivered like a verdict. To him, warfighters were the only ones who counted. I remember leaning against the wall, the weight of my orders in my bag suddenly feeling like a joke. I had the bars, I had the responsibilities, but none of it would ever fit into his definition of pride. He didn't mean it to be cruel. He honestly thought he was just stating fact. That made it worse. Mom wasn't much better. She always tried to soften the blows, telling me, "Your father just wants the best for you." Then she'd pivot to fussing over Taylor's uniform, Taylor's speeches, Taylor's everything. It was like watching someone polish a trophy while pretending the other kid in the house didn't even exist. I learned early on that trying to compete with Taylor on my dad's terms was pointless. She was loud, athletic, perfect for the parade ground. I was quiet, strategic, better at puzzles than push-ups. My victories were invisible. They didn't come with trophies you could display in the living room. The funny part is, Taylor knew it too. She leaned into it. Any chance she got, she'd remind me where the spotlight was. At family dinners, if I tried to share something from school or later from the Navy, she'd cut in with a story about some drill or competition. Dad would steer the conversation her way, and Mom would beam like it was the most natural thing. I got good at stabbing peas with my fork and pretending I wasn't bothered. But I was bothered, every time. One Christmas, Taylor showed up with her academy ring. She made sure to angle it in every photo, the gold catching the light like a lighthouse beam. Dad gave a toast about continuing the Mercer naval legacy, his voice cracking like he was quoting scripture. My name never came up. I could have been the mailman for all they cared. It was around then that I stopped trying to get their attention. If they weren't going to recognize what I did, fine. I'd build a career that didn't need their approval to mean something. But the cracks were there, deep and permanent. You can tell yourself family doesn't matter, that their opinions bounce off you. But when the people who raised you won't even say your name in a toast, it sticks. I guess that's why standing outside Taylor's ceremony hit me so hard. It wasn't just about a missing name on a list. It was the continuation of the same story they'd been telling since we were kids. Taylor's the star, Quinn's the extra. The difference now was that the story wasn't true anymore. Not even close. They didn't know it yet, but I wasn't clipboard kid anymore. The air outside the officers' club was crisp, the kind of sharp air you feel in your teeth. I took a deep breath and thought about every time I'd been sidelined. Every laugh, every ignored accomplishment, every moment where Taylor got the spotlight and I got silence. My hands shook, not from nerves, but from the anger I'd buried for years finally pushing to the surface. I opened the trunk of my car just enough to see the garment bag lying there. The uniform inside wasn't just fabric. It was proof. Proof that I hadn't wasted my career in some office. Proof that the kid with the clipboard had done more than anyone gave her credit for. Proof my family couldn't erase no matter how many lists they rigged. The crowd inside cheered again, muffled through the walls. I pictured Taylor on stage, smiling wide, my dad clapping like she'd just won the Super Bowl. It was always her moment. Always their moment together. My name was never invited. This time, though, I wasn't going to let them write me out. I pulled the garment bag halfway out of the trunk before stopping. My fingers traced the zipper, but instead of opening it, my mind slid back to the first time I decided to take a different road than the one my dad and Taylor worshipped. When I joined the Navy, nobody was impressed. Dad expected me to go surface warfare, maybe aviation if I could pull it off. He wanted something he could brag about at the VFW, something with medals and sea stories. Instead, I slid into intelligence. I didn't march in parades or shout commands on a deck. I sat in a room with glowing screens and files stamped classified. To most people, that sounded boring. To me, it felt like actual power. My first assignment was aboard the USS Roosevelt, tucked away in a cramped space filled with servers and too much coffee. I wasn't running drills on the flight deck. I was running code, looking for threats that didn't wave flags or fire guns. It didn't take long for people to notice I had a knack for spotting patterns others missed. I'd catch details in a data stream that made seasoned officers double back. That's how I earned the nickname Watchtower. I wasn't on the front lines, but I could see farther than most. One night, we intercepted strange signals bouncing between nodes that shouldn't have been talking to each other. At first, the team chalked it up to noise. I dug deeper. Turned out someone was probing our carrier strike group's navigation systems. If they'd gotten through, they could have scrambled coordinates for an entire ship with over 5,000 personnel aboard. I brought it to the watch officer, who dismissed it. Said I was chasing ghosts. I didn't let it go. I stayed up 36 hours, monitoring, tracing, building countermeasures while the rest of the crew rotated shifts. By the time the attackers tried again, they hit a wall I'd built out of misdirection and code that sent them chasing decoys halfway across the Pacific. They never knew how close they'd been, and nobody outside our room ever would. The admiral in charge called me into a secure compartment the next day. He shook my hand, said, "Outstanding work, Lieutenant. You just saved a carrier group." That was it. No ceremony, no photo op, just a handshake in a room where no one else was allowed. I went back to my quarters and crashed for 12 hours, then got up and did it all over again. Back home, Taylor was posting photos in her dress whites, lined up with classmates on the academy steps. My mom printed them out and mailed me copies like I didn't have internet. Dad showed the photos to his buddies, bragging about how his eldest was keeping the family name alive. Meanwhile, I couldn't even tell them I'd just stopped what could have been a disaster on the open sea. If I tried, they wouldn't understand. Or worse, they'd brush it off with a, "That's nice, Quinn," the same way they always had. I stopped bringing it up. Easier to let them think I was pushing papers. Less exhausting than explaining how cyber defense isn't just typing fast. You either catch the threat, or you don't, and when you don't, people die. But you can't exactly make that into a Christmas card update. The thing is, I liked the shadows. I liked not having to parade around with every accomplishment. I liked knowing the real story even if nobody else did. It gave me freedom. My career wasn't tied to applause, it was tied to outcomes. The longer I worked in intelligence, the more I realized I didn't need recognition to know I was making an impact. Still, there were nights it got to me. Sitting in my quarters, scrolling through family emails, I'd see paragraph after paragraph about Taylor's awards, her speeches, her mentors praising her leadership. My promotions barely rated a line. Quinn advanced, too. That was it, like an afterthought tacked onto the end of a grocery list. I learned to stop opening the emails sometimes. It was easier that way. But silence has a way of turning heavy when it's your family doing the ignoring. I remembered one particular visit home. Taylor had just finished a summer cruise and she brought a stack of photos to show everyone at dinner. Shots of her on the bridge, her giving orders, her standing with her division. My dad ate it up. He kept saying, "Look at her presence. That's what leadership looks like." When it was my turn to share something, I mentioned a recent exercise where my team detected a simulated breach hours before anyone expected. I thought maybe they'd at least nod. My dad looked at me, then at Taylor and said, "See, this is why I want you on the deck, Taylor. Real leadership. Not sitting in a room full of screens." He didn't even look back at me. That was the night I decided I wasn't going to chase their approval anymore. If they couldn't see it, that was on them. My career wasn't going to stop because they couldn't understand it. On the Roosevelt, the nickname Watchtower stuck. I didn't love it, didn't hate it. It was just who I was. Always watching, always catching what others missed. That was enough for me, and for the people who relied on me. But as I stood there by my car outside Taylor's ceremony, hearing the muffled applause inside, I realized something I'd ignored for years. It wasn't enough anymore. I wasn't angry that my dad didn't brag about me. I wasn't bitter that Taylor hogged the spotlight. I was pissed that they had actively erased me, just like the watch officer tried to erase what I'd seen on that screen years earlier. The difference back then was that I fought to prove I was right, and I saved a ship because of it. I wasn't about to let my family get away with pretending I didn't exist. Not this time. I slammed the trunk shut harder than I meant to, the sound bouncing across the lot. For a second, it felt like the kind of punctuation I never got at the dinner table back home. Those meals were always rehearsals for how invisible I could be. One Thanksgiving stands out. The Mercers don't do quiet holidays. My mom insists on cooking like she's feeding a platoon. My dad sets the table with military precision, and Taylor arrives like she's the guest of honor at a parade. That year, she'd just finished a training cruise, and she came in wearing her uniform, even though no one asked her to. Mom beamed like she'd just been handed a grandchild. Dinner started fine. Turkey, stuffing, the usual. But the second conversation turned to the Navy, the spotlight locked on Taylor. She described every drill, every watch rotation, like she was narrating a documentary. Dad kept nodding, saying things like, "That's leadership," and "That's why you'll go far." The rest of the family ate it up, hanging on every word like she'd just stormed Normandy instead of standing a mid-watch. I waited for a break, some space to mention what I was doing. When I finally got a word in, I said I'd been working with a team tracking a cyber exercise that simulated an attack on a destroyer. We'd caught the breach hours ahead of schedule. Before I could explain, Taylor cut me off with, "Oh, that's cute. Quinn does the computer puzzles." The table laughed, like she'd told a joke worth repeating. I tried again. "It wasn't just puzzles. If it had been real, the ship." Dad waved his fork. "Taylor, tell them about that engineering officer who wanted you on his watch team." Just like that, the spotlight swung back to her. My mom clapped her hands, thrilled. I sat there, fork in hand, staring at my plate like maybe the mashed potatoes would give me more respect than my family ever had. The more I spoke, the less anyone listened. My uncle asked Taylor about physical training. My aunt wanted to know how she balanced work with social life, and I faded into the background, chewing silently. That wasn't a one-off. Every family dinner followed the same script. Taylor talked, Dad bragged, Mom fussed, and I became background noise. It didn't matter if I'd pulled off something critical at work or been promoted. I could be sitting there in full uniform and still get less recognition than Taylor telling a story about cleaning a bulkhead. At one dinner, I finally lost it. Taylor was bragging about how her division had scored high marks on a readiness inspection. Dad raised his glass, saying, "To Taylor, the future of the Mercer Navy legacy." Everyone toasted. I muttered, "I was promoted to captain last week." The table went silent for a second. Then Mom smiled politely and said, "That's nice, honey," before turning back to Taylor to ask about her next assignment. I wanted to flip the table right then. Instead, I excused myself, walked to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on my face. My reflection looked back at me, jaw clenched, eyes burning, trying not to cry like a teenager who didn't get picked for the team. I hated that it still hurt. I hated that I cared. But no matter how much I told myself their approval didn't matter, it always did. When I returned to the table, no one asked where I'd been. My seat might as well have been empty. They laughed at another one of Taylor's stories while my dinner went cold. I ate in silence, nodding when necessary, smiling when forced. The last straw came at a Christmas dinner. Taylor had just been recognized publicly for her leadership during a training exercise. Dad wouldn't stop bragging. I tried to share that I'd coordinated an operation with Allied forces overseas, something that had prevented a real-world crisis. Taylor interrupted with, "Quinn's work is top secret," which usually means it doesn't really happen. Everyone laughed again, including Dad. That laugh stayed with me longer than any insult. It said more than words. Taylor's stories mattered, mine didn't. So I started pulling away. I showed up to fewer dinners, answered fewer emails, stopped volunteering information. If they didn't care, I wouldn't waste my breath. But every absence only seemed to confirm what they already believed, that I wasn't really part of the story. Back outside the officers' club, standing by my car, I felt the weight of all those dinners pressing down on me, the way my family trained me to accept silence as my place, the way Taylor used every chance to shove me to the edge, the way Dad refused to even consider that leadership could look like anything other than barking orders on a deck. The muffled sound of applause inside grew louder as the doors opened briefly. Guests streamed in, laughing, adjusting their uniforms, carrying that same air of smug celebration I'd seen around our table for years. The ceremony wasn't just about Taylor's rank. It was about the family story they'd been telling forever. Taylor the star, Quinn the extra. But extras don't get uniforms hanging in garment bags. Extras don't get nicknames like Watchtower from crews who relied on them. Extras don't save carrier groups from cyber threats. I clenched my jaw and reached again for the trunk, this time with more certainty. The metal latch clicked under my hand, and as the trunk opened wider, the smell of pressed fabric hit me. That sharp, sterile scent pulled me back to a different uniform, a different night when I was buried in reports, while the rest of the world had no clue what we were stopping. It was called Operation Silent Wave. The name sounded like some Navy PR stunt, but it was anything but. Intelligence flagged a freighter in the Caribbean. On paper, it was hauling industrial supplies. In reality, it carried enough weapons to arm a small militia. The kind of shipment that could tip an entire region into chaos if it slipped through. I was sitting in a windowless operations center, headset on, screens lighting up with live feeds and coded chatter. My role wasn't glamorous. I wasn't storming the deck with a rifle. I was coordinating between the Coast Guard, Michigan 6, and our own Navy assets. The room smelled like burnt coffee and nervous sweat, but nobody complained. Everyone knew what was at stake. We tracked the freighter for hours. Every time it changed course, every time it slowed, my team called out updates. There was a window too early and we'd blow the cover. Too late and the ship could vanish into international gray zones. I remember staring at the map, knowing that one wrong call would either tip off the smugglers or lose them for good. The Coast Guard cutter we had shadowing the freighter was close, but not close enough. I made the call to Vector in a Navy destroyer from the east, forcing the freighter's captain to choose. Run north into waiting aircraft or south where we'd boxed him in. He tried north, bad choice. By the time the boarding team hit the deck, the smugglers barely knew what was happening. The cargo hold told the real story. Crates of rifles, explosives, and enough ammunition to keep a war burning for months. The operation wrapped before dawn. No shots fired, no headlines. Just another logistical intercept filed away in a report. When it was over, the Coast Guard commander sent a short message. Outstanding coordination. Couldn't have done it without you. That was all. No parade, no applause, no family toast. I walked back to my quarters at 3 a.m., peeled off my uniform, and slept like the dead. The next morning, I woke up to an email chain from my family. Photos of Taylor at some reception, Dad bragging about how she'd impressed a visiting admiral. My name wasn't mentioned. Not once. That was the rhythm of my life. Save a ship, stop a crisis, get a polite thank you, and then open my inbox to a family newsletter, where Taylor was the only star. People think the hard part of military intelligence is the stress of getting it wrong. That's true. But for me, the harder part was knowing that every victory I had was invisible outside the secure walls of my job. My dad could talk for hours about Taylor leading a drill, but he couldn't spare 30 seconds to understand what it meant to intercept an illegal weapons shipment before it reached the wrong hands. I used to fantasize just once about standing up at a family dinner and saying, "Actually, I stopped an international incident last week. What did you do, Taylor? Shine your shoes faster?" But of course I couldn't. The missions were classified, and even if I could tell them, I doubted they'd care. Still, Silent Wave stuck with me. Not because of the operation itself, we'd had plenty of intercepts before and after, but because it reminded me how wide the gap was between the work I did and the recognition I got. My team knew. The Coast Guard knew. A handful of officers in London knew. That was enough to keep the world steady. But my family? To them, I was still clipboard kid. I looked back into the trunk, at the crisp white uniform bag sitting there like a challenge. That night in the ops center, I had worn the same style of uniform, hidden under a headset and a pile of reports. No one outside that room cared then, and no one inside this building cared now. Another burst of laughter echoed from the officers' club, snapping me back. Guests kept streaming inside, straightening their medals, shaking hands like they'd all personally won the war. I could imagine Taylor soaking it up, telling some story about her watch team while Dad puffed his chest like he'd raised George Washington. The truth was, she'd never run an op like Silent Wave. She'd never had to balance 3 different commands, make a call that could prevent a bloodbath, and then walk away without credit. She'd never know what it felt like to sit in silence while the world stayed intact because of you. That was fine. She didn't need to know, but I wasn't about to let her erase me one more time. I shut the trunk again, this time softer, and the muffled cheers from inside rolled over me like another reminder of how much of the Mercer family's story had always belonged to Taylor. She never had to fight for the spotlight. It was practically written into the family script. Her career moved like clockwork. Every few months there was another announcement. Taylor gave the keynote at some leadership seminar. Taylor was selected for a special program. Taylor got glowing reviews from her CO. Mom turned every update into a bragging session. Dad treated each one like a battle victory. They collected her accomplishments the way some people collect coins, except they actually cared about these. Meanwhile, I was advancing faster than most officers my age, but the silence from home was deafening. My emails got short replies, if any. Taylor sent photos in uniform. Everyone praised her posture. I sent news about my promotion. Dad answered once with, "Good. Focus on real Navy work next." That was his way of saying intelligence didn't count. The more Taylor succeeded, the more she leaned into rubbing it in. At family events, she'd corner me with that smile, the one she saved for moments when she wanted me to know she'd won. "Quinn, do you ever feel like your job doesn't really count? I mean, pushing papers must be nice, but you'll never know what it's like to command sailors face to face." She'd say it loud enough for the whole room to hear. People laughed. Even Mom chuckled, though she tried to cover it with a sip of wine. I didn't answer most of the time. What was the point? If I defended myself, I looked defensive. If I ignored her, she looked right. She knew that, and she loved it. One summer, Dad threw a cookout to celebrate Taylor's selection for a leadership program. He invited half the neighborhood and all his old shipmates. Taylor strutted in wearing her uniform again, like she was leading the parade. When Dad raised his glass, he actually said, "To Taylor, the living proof of the Mercer naval legacy." The backyard roared with applause. I was standing right there, holding a plate of food I suddenly didn't want. My promotion orders to lieutenant commander were sitting in my bag in the house. Nobody asked about them. Nobody even remembered. Later that night, I caught Taylor in the kitchen. She leaned on the counter, smirking. "You know, Quinn, you should really think about a different career. I just don't see you making it where it matters. You're more of a supporting role, like the tech person who keeps the printers running." That one stung more than I wanted to admit. Not because it was true, but because she said it with such confidence, knowing Dad would agree. In her mind, she was the warrior, and I was the help. I wanted to fire back. I wanted to tell her about Silent Wave, about Iron Net, about the operations she could never dream of leading. But I couldn't. The clearance walls were too high, and even if I broke them, she'd just roll her eyes. So I swallowed it and walked away, plate still in my hand, food untouched. Taylor thrived on those moments. Every new ribbon, every new job, every new speech was another excuse to push me further into the background. And Dad fed it. He'd beam when she spoke, nod when she boasted, and echo every word like it was gospel. I started noticing how people looked at us when we were together. Friends of the family would ask Taylor about deployments, then glance at me like they were trying to remember if I even had a rank. One guy once asked if I worked in admin, as if I was filing leave requests while my sister was saving the fleet. Taylor laughed and didn't bother to correct him. The pattern was always the same. Taylor shone, I disappeared. She was the story, I was the footnote. And no matter how far I'd climbed, no matter how many operations I'd quietly shaped from behind the curtain, I couldn't change the way my family defined me. Not yet. Out in the parking lot, staring at the officers' club, I felt the weight of every one of those humiliations pressing on me. Taylor had erased me from the guest list because she knew she could. Because to her, I'd never been more than this shadow in her perfect photo. But shadows don't stay quiet forever. I dragged my nails lightly against the trunk's edge, the metal cold under my fingertips, and it reminded me of another night I spent clutching a console so hard my knuckles turned white. That one was called Operation Night Lantern, and it still sits in my head like a scar no one can see. We got the call late, almost too late. A SEAL team had gone dark in a hostile region, cut off after their comms were jammed. Extraction was on the line, but without eyes in the sky, they were basically ghosts stumbling through enemy territory. The clock was running out. I was in the ops center, headset on, staring at a screen that looked like chaos. Fragmented data, partial satellite feeds, weather overlays, it was a mess. The team leader's last words had been clipped, a half-finished sentence before silence. If we didn't re-establish coverage, they were done. I had an option, but it wasn't clean. Another satellite was assigned to a completely different theater, monitoring potential missile tests. Moving it meant leaving that sector blind for hours. Nobody wanted to make that call. Nobody except me. I pushed it up the chain, fast. We reroute, we give them a corridor out. If we don't, we lose them. The first response I got was, not authorized. The second was, risk too high. But while they were debating, the team was still stuck out there. So I did what I had to. I adjusted the tasking myself, pulling the feed over, splicing coordinates until the new coverage painted a narrow but workable path. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. On the screen, I watched tiny blips move, each one tied to a life on the ground. The SEALs shifted toward the corridor, ducking into cover, pausing, then moving again. Every footstep was a gamble. Enemy patrols were circling, and the weather was turning ugly. But the satellite gave them eyes they wouldn't have had otherwise. Minutes felt like hours. I tracked them until finally I saw the signal of their extraction bird approaching. One by one, the blips converged, then lifted. Safe. Alive. I pulled off my headset, my ears ringing in the silence that followed. The room was dead quiet, except for one officer who looked at me like I'd just broken every rule in the book. Maybe I had. But the SEALs were alive, and rules don't mean much if everyone you're supposed to protect ends up dead. Later, in a secure debrief, a senior officer stared me down. You took a risk you weren't cleared to take. I nodded. He didn't smile, didn't thank me. He just signed the report and moved on. The whole operation stayed buried under classification. Weeks later, a note showed up on my desk, handwritten, short. Thank you. A teammate you saved. That was it. No signature, no detail. Just a reminder that somewhere out there, a group of men walked away from a mission because I'd made a call no one else would. Back home, my family was celebrating Taylor's next assignment. She gave a toast about leading from the front. Dad clapped like she'd cured cancer, and I sat in silence. I couldn't exactly raise my glass and say, actually, I redirected a satellite and saved a SEAL team last week. Even if I could, they wouldn't have believed me. That's how it always was. The most important things I did couldn't be shared, and the things I could share weren't valued. It was a lose-lose game. Standing outside the officers' club now, I thought about those SEALs. The ones who never knew my face but knew my work. The ones who'd trusted someone in a dark room with a headset to keep them alive. They'd never laugh at me for computer puzzles. They knew better. The trunk light flickered overhead, casting a glow on the uniform bag. It wasn't about bragging. It wasn't about rubbing it in Taylor's face. It was about walking in as the officer those SEALs would salute without hesitation, even if my own family never would. I let the trunk lid rest halfway down, holding it there with one hand. The weight reminded me of the last time something heavy sat on my shoulders the day I got pinned as a captain. Most officers get a room full of people clapping, proud families snapping photos, champagne flowing after the ceremony. I got a conference room with 10 chairs, 8 of them filled by people who looked like they had somewhere else to be. A senior officer read my orders, shook my hand, and pinned the new silver eagle onto my shoulder boards. The whole thing took less than 15 minutes. No cameras, no speeches, no family. Just a quick nod and back to work. I remember standing in front of the mirror that night in my quarters, staring at the rank. It looked sharp, but it felt strange. Like an inside joke only I knew. Promotions are supposed to be milestones you share. Mine was just another classified footnote. Still, I emailed my parents. Short, simple, promoted today to captain. I attached a picture of the insignia, thinking maybe the image would get through to them more than words ever had. Mom replied the next day, "Congratulations, Taylor just got selected for another leadership role. You two are making us proud." That was it. Not even a separate sentence. Just my news crammed into Taylor's shadow, like always. Dad didn't bother writing back. Taylor did, though. A text popped up on my phone 2 days later. "Good for you. Don't expect a big deal." That was her entire message. I stared at it, half laughing, half furious. Only Taylor could turn someone else's promotion into a punchline. I didn't reply. There was no point. At work, I kept doing my job, kept running ops that never made headlines, kept carrying the kind of responsibility that would make most people sweat through their uniforms. Every decision felt like a coin toss with human lives on the line. And yet the people closest to me treated it like I was stapling reports. The truth is, part of me had stopped expecting anything else. It was easier to live in the silence than to bang my head against their wall of indifference. The recognition I wanted wasn't coming, and I knew it. So I made peace with it. At least that's what I told myself. But the silence always found cracks. I'd walk into a secure briefing with admirals who trusted me to keep entire regions stable, and 5 hours later I'd be on a family call where Dad bragged about Taylor's latest drill. The whiplash was brutal. That's when I started realizing the gap wasn't just about respect. It was about visibility. My family couldn't see what I did, so to them, it didn't exist. They measured worth in applause and photo ops. My work was measured in lives saved, most of which they'd never even hear about. It hit me hardest the night I got back to my quarters after another 14-hour shift. I set my cover down, sat on the edge of the bed, and checked my phone. Group text. A flood of pictures of Taylor at a banquet, Dad's caption, "Another proud night for the Mercers." Nobody had noticed that I hadn't said a word about my own promotion in days. I stared at the photo of Taylor holding a plaque, everyone around her clapping. I looked at my reflection in the mirror across the room, the silver eagle on my shoulder boards catching the dim light. For once, I laughed. Not the happy kind. More like the kind you let out when the joke's been on you for years and you finally get it. If they weren't going to acknowledge it, fine, I'd carry it myself. Back outside the officers' club now, I felt that same weight settle again. The uniform bag wasn't just fabric and metal. It was proof just like that silver eagle had been. Proof I'd climbed higher than they ever thought I could. Proof Taylor's digs about support roles were nothing but noise. Proof my dad's silence didn't erase the reality of what I'd earned. Inside, applause rolled again, another wave of cheers for Taylor. My jaw tightened, but my hands didn't shake. The silence they gave me back then had taught me something. Recognition doesn't need their permission. I let the trunk close again, this time all the way, and leaned against it like I needed the metal to steady me. Inside, the applause was still rolling, muffled but steady, like background music for a show I wasn't invited to. My name missing from the list wasn't an accident. Taylor had made sure of that. I walked a few steps toward the entrance, then stopped. The sailor at the door glanced at me nervously, probably hoping I wouldn't cause a scene. He didn't have to worry. I wasn't about to beg for entry. That's what Taylor expected, that I'd sulk back to my car and disappear. Just another supporting role written out of the script. Instead, I turned back and popped the trunk. The garment bag lay across the back seat, the zipper gleaming in the sunlight. For years, I kept that uniform close out of habit, ready for last-minute orders or unexpected assignments. Today, it was something else. It was a weapon, sharper than anything Taylor could throw at me. I slid the bag out carefully, like I was handling something fragile, and carried it to the front seat. The fabric was cool under my fingers as I unzipped it. The whites caught the light, perfect creases, polished buttons, every seam screaming regulation. I'd pressed it myself the night before, not for this ceremony, but because habits die hard. Funny how that habit had just turned into my lifeline. Piece by piece, I changed in the car. Slacks first, jacket next, fastening each button with deliberate care. The world outside went quiet in my head, every sound muffled by the focus it took to put on that uniform. The collar settled against my neck like it had always belonged there. Finally, I pulled the insignia from its case. The silver eagle, shining, undeniable. The weight of it clicked into place on my shoulder boards, and just like that, the Quinn they thought they could erase was gone. The officer I had fought to become was sitting in her place. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring into the rearview mirror. The reflection didn't look like the kid with a clipboard. It didn't look like the sister they mocked at family dinners. It looked like an officer who had carried lives in her hands and come out standing. For the first time that day, my hands stopped shaking. The applause inside swelled again, leaking through the walls. Taylor was probably on stage, smiling, basking in the attention she always got. Dad would be clapping like a metronome, Mom dabbing her eyes, guests whispering about how impressive she was. They didn't know what was coming. I opened the car door and stepped out. The sun hit my uniform, and heads turned in the parking lot. A few guests paused, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they watched me adjust my cover and square my shoulders. None of them knew who I was yet, but they could see I belonged. That was the thing about the uniform it did, the talking before you ever opened your mouth. My heels clicked against the pavement as I walked toward the entrance. The sailor at the door froze, eyes darting from my insignia to my face. He didn't even try to stop me this time. He straightened up, his hand twitching, like he wasn't sure if he should salute. I gave him a nod, nothing more, and kept walking. The hallway stretched out ahead, lined with portraits of past officers, all stern faces and stiff collars. My reflection flashed in the glass frames as I passed, the silver eagle gleaming with each step. Every click of my heels echoed louder than the applause inside. I pushed open the double doors, and the sound hit me full force. Laughter, clinking glasses, the MC warming up the microphone. The crowd was packed, rows of uniforms and civilians shoulder to shoulder, every eye focused on the stage. Taylor stood front and center, radiant, her new rank catching the light. My parents sat in the front row, leaning forward with pride so thick it practically fogged the air. No one noticed me at first. I slipped in through the side aisle, my steps steady, my cover tilted just so. The uniform drew a few glances, whispers starting in the back. Heads turned slowly, like a ripple, across water. Taylor's smile faltered when her eyes finally found me. For once, she didn't have a line ready. Her mouth twitched, and she looked toward Dad, but even he seemed caught off guard. Mom's hands froze mid-clap, her face pale. I kept walking, not rushing, not hesitating. Just steady, just visible. The one thing they could never erase again. The air inside hit warmer than I expected, thick with cologne, perfume, and the faint smell of catered food. My heels tapped against polished wood, and each step pulled more eyes away from the stage. The whispers spread fast, like people trying to figure out if they'd missed an announcement. Up front, the MC adjusted his microphone, oblivious to what was happening in the back. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all give a round of applause for Lieutenant Commander Taylor Mercer, continuing the proud Mercer family tradition. The clapping roared, all of it aimed at the stage. Taylor's smile came back for a second as she raised her chin, basking in the noise. But the smile didn't last. The whispers grew louder, the ripple pushing closer to the front, and by the time she looked back at me, her eyes had narrowed. I didn't break stride. My pace stayed steady, cover tucked just right, uniform crisp. The kind of entrance you don't need to announce because the room announces it for you. One of the Navy SEALs seated halfway down the aisle was the first to react. He froze, blinked hard, then stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. His voice cut through the applause like a blade. "Attention on deck." The words detonated in the hall. Every seal in the room shot to their feet in unison, chairs clattering against the floor. The clapping stopped instantly, replaced by the thunder of boots slamming into the ground and spines snapping straight. 300 seals stood at rigid attention. Every eye locked on me. The MC stuttered into his mic, his voice breaking mid-sentence. He glanced around, panic creeping into his tone as he realized the entire rhythm of the ceremony had just been hijacked. Taylor's jaw dropped, her hand frozen mid-wave. Dad, front row, still holding his glass, looked like someone had just pulled the rug out from under him. Mom's eyes went wide, her hand covering her mouth. I kept moving. The aisle stretched long, lined with uniforms and stunned faces. The crowd parted on its own, no one daring to block the path. Every step echoed in the silence, the weight of 300 men and women standing tall behind me. I didn't smile, I didn't wave. This wasn't about theatrics. This was about showing up, visible, undeniable, exactly what they'd tried to erase. The seals didn't rise for politeness. They didn't rise for show. They rose because they knew the work I'd done, even if no one in that front row had bothered to ask. They knew the ops that never made the papers, the missions where their lives had depended on the invisible officer in a secure room, rerouting satellites and intercepting threats. That respect hit harder than any applause I'd ever heard. The MC fumbled again, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant Commander Quinn Mercer." His voice cracked like he was unsure if saying my name out loud would get him fired. A fresh round of applause broke out, shaky at first, then rolling stronger as the officers in the room realized what was happening. Some clapped politely, others looked stunned. A few glanced at each other like they were wondering how they'd missed the memo. Taylor stayed frozen on stage, caught between fury and fear. Her smile was gone, replaced with a look that could cut steel. I didn't bother returning it. My eyes stayed forward, my heels steady, until I reached the front row. I stopped at the front row, the sound of 300 chairs scraping against the floor still hanging in the air like thunder that refused to fade. The seals stayed locked in formation, boots planted, arms at their sides, eyes straight on me. The rest of the room sat frozen, unsure whether to follow or just keep staring. The MC gripped the podium like it might steady him. His face was pale, voice shaky as he stammered, "Captain Quinn Mercer, front row." He almost whispered it, like saying it too loud might make the roof collapse. The ripple moved fast. Officers shifted, guests leaned forward, and the spotlight that had been fixed on Taylor a second ago burned straight through me now. I didn't speed up. I didn't slow down. My heels carried me down the last few steps, each click of leather against the polished floor louder than the applause that tried to catch up behind me. Taylor's face was a storm. She didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't even breathe as far as I could tell. Her jaw clenched so tight I half expected her teeth to crack. Dad still had his glass raised halfway, stuck mid-toast like someone had hit pause on him. His eyes drilled into mine, confused, angry, maybe even scared. Mom sat stiff in her seat, both hands pressed flat against her chest, eyes wide, lips parted like she couldn't find air. The seals didn't move, didn't flinch. They stood because they knew. They'd sat in debriefs where my name came up without ever meeting me. They'd been on missions that only worked because somewhere far away, I'd rerouted satellites, jammed signals, or pulled intelligence out of nothing. They didn't care that my dad thought intelligence was paperwork. They knew better. And that's why they stood. The aisle cleared for me without a word. Commanders shifted their knees in, ensigns scrambled their feet back, civilians leaned out of the way. The crowd parted like it had been rehearsed, but nobody had rehearsed this. Nobody could have. I reached the front row, turned, and sat down slowly. My cover rested neatly in my lap. I didn't look left or right. I didn't need to. The silence said enough. Behind me, the seals finally sat back down, every chair hitting the floor in perfect unison. The sound was deafening, more powerful than any applause. The MC tried to recover, fumbling through his notes, voice cracking as he moved the ceremony forward, but everyone's attention was shot. Nobody cared about the script anymore. Taylor's eyes flicked between me and the audience, desperate to reel the spotlight back. She tried to smile, but it looked forced, brittle, the kind of smile that cracks under pressure. Dad's stare didn't waver. It wasn't pride, not yet. It was recognition. For the first time in my life, he was seeing me as something other than a footnote. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Not the performative dab she gave Taylor's speeches, but something raw. I sat perfectly still, shoulders squared, eyes forward. I didn't need to say a word. My uniform and the seals had already done the talking for me. The MC cleared his throat again. Ladies and gentlemen, please continue your applause for both Mercers, representing proud service to the United States Navy. It was an awkward attempt to balance the scales, but the room didn't buy it. The applause came, yes, but it was scattered, uneven, overshadowed by the memory of those 300 boots slamming down together. I heard murmurs around me. A vice admiral leaned toward another officer, whispering my name with a nod. A junior officer 2 rows back mouthed, "That's her?" like he'd just put a face to a legend. Taylor tried to continue her speech, but her voice wavered. She stumbled over a line, caught herself, then forced her way through. Every slip drew more eyes back to me. I didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't flinch. Sitting there in the front row was enough. The ceremony moved on, but nothing about it felt the same. The MC rushed through parts that were supposed to be highlights, skipping details to get it over with. Guests clapped when prompted, but the energy was gone, replaced by a heavy awareness that something had shifted permanently. When the program finally paused for a transition, the room broke into clusters of conversation. People leaned into each other, whispering, trading theories, glancing at me like I was some classified file that had just been declassified in real time. Taylor stood frozen at the podium, gripping it with white knuckles, her speech notes trembling in her hand. Dad lowered his glass at last, setting it down without drinking. Mom leaned toward him, whispering, her eyes never leaving me. The SEALs stayed calm, back in their seats, but their posture hadn't softened. They'd made their statement. The rest of the room was still catching up. And me? I sat there, uniform crisp, cover in my lap, every muscle steady. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel erased. The applause sputtered out, leaving behind the low hum of conversations and the scrape of chairs shifting. I stayed seated in the front row, my cover balanced neatly in my lap, while the ceremony dissolved into smaller pockets of chatter. Officers clustered near the stage, civilians wandered toward the buffet tables, and the MC looked like he wanted to crawl into the nearest exit. I didn't move. I wanted the weight of my presence to settle into the room the way smoke does, quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. The first to approach was a vice admiral with more ribbons than empty space on his chest. He stepped forward, extended a hand, and said in a low voice, "It's good to finally put a face to the name." His grip was firm, his eyes sharp, but there was respect there. Not curiosity, not pity, respect. He didn't linger, just a nod, a handshake, and he was gone. Another followed. A rear admiral I'd only ever briefed through secure channels. "Your work has kept us moving more times than anyone realizes," he said. No small talk, no questions, just a statement of fact. One by one, others came. Commanders, captains, even a few junior officers. Each offered a nod, a handshake, or a few words meant only for me. No one asked for details, they didn't need them. They already knew enough. Taylor stood frozen at the podium, watching it all. Her smile had collapsed hours ago, replaced with a look that tried to mask panic with composure. Every handshake I got chipped away at the stage she'd been standing on. She finally broke. She came down the steps, walked over with stiff posture, and stopped just a little too close. "How long have you been keeping this a secret?" she asked. Her voice was low, but sharp enough that the officers nearby pretended not to hear while still clearly listening. 15 years, I said. Her eyes widened for a second, then narrowed. She opened her mouth, closed it, and stepped back. For the first time in her life, Taylor Mercer didn't have a comeback. I turned slightly and caught Dad's eyes. He was still seated, glass on the table in front of him, untouched. His face was unreadable at first, anger, confusion, pride, all fighting for space. He didn't speak. He just stood, walked over slowly, and stopped in front of me. For a moment, he just looked at the uniform, his gaze tracing the lines, the insignia, the medals I never displayed. Finally, he gave one slow nod. No words, no dramatic speech, just a nod. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close. but it was acknowledgement, something I'd never gotten from him before. I nodded back. That was enough. Around us, the crowd thinned. Glasses clinked, laughter picked up again, but the mood had shifted permanently. The Mercer family script had been rewritten, and this time I wasn't the extra. I stayed seated a little longer, letting the buzz of the room wash over me. For once, it didn't feel like background noise. It felt like I was part of the story, whether my family liked it or not. The hum of conversation still clung to me as I walked out of that hall, but 6 months later the sound I heard was gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled into my parents' driveway. Same brick house, same flag on the porch, same trimmed hedges Dad always measured with military precision. Nothing about the place looked different, but I knew it was. Inside, the air smelled like roast beef and garlic, my mom's default move when she wanted everyone to feel at home. I hung my cover by the door and stepped into the living room. That's when I saw it, the display cabinet. For years, it had been Taylor's shrine. Academy photos, plaques, a perfectly polished sword, and the ring Dad liked to point at when bragging to guests. But now, right in the center, sat one of my medals, my ribbon arranged perfectly, silver catching the light. I stood there longer than I should have, staring, not because of the medal itself. I'd earned plenty that were locked away in safes and drawers, but because of where it was, dead center, visible. A piece of me planted in the Mercer household where no one could ignore it. "Dinner's ready," Mom called from the kitchen. I walked in, slid into my usual seat. The table was set the same way it always was, but the energy wasn't. Dad looked at me differently. Not softer, but sharper, like he'd finally tuned in. Mom asked questions about my work, not vague pleasantries, but real ones. What's it like leading a team that's spread across continents? How do you manage when you're carrying so many decisions at once? Even Taylor asked something, though it came out clumsy. How do you handle, that kind of pressure? Her fork hovered over her plate, like she wasn't sure if she wanted the answer. I told them the truth. Not details, not classified reports, but the reality of command. The sleepless nights. The weight of knowing people's lives hinged on calls you made in seconds. The balance between being precise and being human. They listened. Really listened. No interruptions, no quick pivots back to Taylor. For once, I didn't feel like I was fighting for space at my own dinner table. After dessert, when Mom and Dad cleared the plates, Taylor lingered across from me. She toyed with her napkin, eyes down, then finally looked up. "I always thought I had to stay ahead of you. Like if I slowed down for a second, I'd get left behind. Turns out I never could keep up." She gave a short laugh, not bitter, just honest, and that's okay. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw her words back at her. I just smiled, because in that moment, I understood we'd been carrying different weights all along. She chased applause. I carried silence. Neither of us had it easy, but mine had been invisible until the day I refused to stay erased. Driving home that night, the medal in the cabinet stuck in my mind. It was recognition, sure, but it wasn't the thing that made me whole. That came months earlier, the moment I walked into that hall on my own terms, not as the forgotten sister, but as the officer I had built myself to be. The truth was, I didn't need their nods or their questions anymore. They mattered, yes, but they weren't the measure of me. The real acknowledgement had always been mine to give. And for the first time, I had. The road stretched ahead in quiet dark, headlights cutting clean lines across the asphalt. My hands rested easy on the wheel. No shaking, no doubt, just steady. I wasn't invisible anymore, and even if they tried, they'd never erase me again. Looking back, I realized the promotion ceremony wasn't just about rank or medals or who sat in the front row. It was about rewriting a story my family had told for years, a story where I was invisible. Walking into that hall didn't erase the past, but it made one thing clear. I didn't need anyone's permission to take my place. For years, I chased recognition that never came, hoping my dad would toast me, hoping Taylor would see me as an equal, hoping my family would understand. None of that ever happened. What did happen was better. I stopped waiting. I showed up for myself. The seals standing, the officers shaking my hand, the medal in the cabinet. They mattered, sure. But the real victory was realizing I'd already earned everything I needed the moment I chose not to walk away. That was the day I stopped being erased, not because they let me in,